religion was a very serious matter.
That's actionable.
Religion was a very serious matter in those days, and you poked fun at religion. You know, it would be dangerous to poke fun at religion in those days, because the local church sessions, for example, all over Scotland, were actually trying to run a reign of religious and moral terror for the whole of the population. It was not unusual, for example, for vigilante patrols to be sent out from the church session to try and catch offenders, people who might be whistling or staring idly out the window on a Sabbath day, people who even played bowls on a weekday, or people who indulged in drinking or dancing or having for fornication. I mean, that was completely out of the question on Thursday. It reminds me of the kind of joke they told about the wee freeze. There's no wee freeze in here.
Think you're safe there.
They were like the kind of provisional wing of the Scottish, of the Church of Scotland at the time. And it was said that they were opposed to couples having sex standing up because it might lead to dancing. So, in that kind of atmosphere, it took not a little bit of courage for Burns to pen that wonderful poem, Holy Willie's Prayer, where he mocks the self-righteousness of Holy Willie. O Lord, thou ken what zeal I bear, when drinkers drink and swearers swear, and singing here and dancing there with great and small, for I am keepit by thy fear, free from it all. And then goes on to ridicule the double standards of Holy Willie by talking about the lawless leg that he lifted in bed, and the 3 times he speared Lizzie's lass, and so on. But above all, I think we've got to rescue Burns as a politician, as a political person, from those who tried to paint Burns as somebody who was a British patriot, somebody who was a royalist, somebody who was a sworn opponent of Jacobinism. And remember, Jacobinism in the 18th century was like Bolshevism in the early 20th century. It was the great threat to the established order of capitalism at the time. And those who try to argue that Burns was that kind of person forget that Burns was a poor man. You know, that he spent most of his life in poverty. There's a verse in the Tale of Twa Dogs which talks about a poor tenant body scant cash, who has to thole a factor stamping and cursing and swearing and threatening to pound his goods and to turn him and his family out of their house. And that was directly from Burns' own experience. He experienced that in his father's farm in the earliest part of his life. And all his life, Burns lived in mortal fear of getting into debt. He felt that him and his family were always trembling on the abyss of poverty. And therefore, yes, he did take a job as the King's excise man. Yes, he did publish poems in which you can find lines about God save the King and so on. But he did that because he had to do that, because it was the only way he could earn a crust. And we should never forget that Burns lived in one of the most dangerous and revolutionary times in our history. He was just 13 years, well, he was born 13 years before the clans had been slaughtered on the field at McAllion. In his life, the Act of Union was still greatly disputed here in Scotland, and deeply hated the Act of Union here in Scotland. The future of the Hanoverian monarchy at that time was still hugely in question. He was only 16 when the first shots were fired in the American War of Independence. He was only 30 when the French Revolution erupted. He was a contemporary, as Colin said, of Thomas Muir, the young radical lawyer here in Edinburgh, who headed the Scottish Friends of the People, and he was arguing for universal suffrage, amongst the first people ever to do so in the world. He was a contemporary of Tom Paine, and he would have known very well the incendiary rights of man that Tom Paine wrote. And he also lived under one of the most reactionary Tory governments that has ever been the misfortune for anybody in this country to live under. His Scotland was no democracy. The 45 MPs that we sent down to Westminster were elected by a handful of voters who came from rotten boroughs and corrupt councils. A bit like Scotland, I suppose, in some ways. And all of them were placed, and all of them were hangers-on who were bought and sold by royal patronage and bribery. And Scotland was ruled at that time by an iron fist. The Home Secretary was a man called Henry Dundas, and his nephew was Robert Dundas, the Scottish Lord Advocate. And with their spy network, they actually sent fear all over Scotland against anybody who would dare to speak out against the establishment of the day. And they were ably supported by the likes of Lord Braxfield, a hanging judge, whose philosophy is best summed up, I think, in one of his utterances when he said, "If you hang a thief when he's young, he'll no steal when he's old." And he was the man that sent Thomas Muir to 14 years of transportation in Botany Bay. And he was also the man that sent some poor soul here in Edinburgh for exactly the same 14 years in Botany Bay, because he'd thrown a stone in the direction of the military in Edinburgh's George Square. And Burns understood the dangers of speaking out against that kind of establishment when he wrote himself, "The shrinking bard of down an alley skulks, and dreads a meeting worse than Woolwich hulks. Though there his heresies in church and state might well award him Muir and Palmer's fate. Palmer, like Muir, was tried for sedition and sent to transportation." Yet, despite the dangers that were involved, Burns dared to carry on with his political heresies against the British state. And his views on the hated Act of Union, for example, were really summed up in such a parcel of robes in the nation bought and sold for English gold. His support for Jacobinism was very clear, with the fact that he tried to send carronades to the French revolutions. And even the national anthem, the other Scottish national anthem, Scots Wha Hae, which was penned by Burns himself, it's not just about Burns and Wallace, about Bruce and Wallace and independence. As Burns himself said, it's about other struggles, not quite so ancient. And he meant by that the struggles against the Tory government of his own day. I mean, the lines, "Lay the proud usurper low, tyrants fall in every foe, liberties in every blow, let us do or die." He had Pitt and Dundas in his mind when he wrote those lines. And the expression "let us do or die" actually comes from the secret oath of the Scottish Friends of the People, which is live free or die. And Burns really was a tremendous person. He was subjected himself to a 3-month-long inquiry by his employers, because one night in Dumfries, when he was at the theatre, a group of loyalists started singing "God Save the King," and he was among a group of radicals who sang the French Revolutionary anthem, "Sa Ira." Sa Ira has got lines in it like "burn and hang the Aristos," and he was singing that and was subjected to a 3-month inquiry because he did that. We also know now that one of his favourite toasts was one of the toasts of the reformers and radicals at that time, which is to the last verse of the last chapter of the last book of Kings. And of course they weren't talking about the Bible when they spoke about that. So Burns was no royalist, he was no British patriot, he was no enemy of Jacobitism. In fact, he was the opposite of all these things. He was a Republican, he was a Scottish nationalist, he was a Jacobin supporter. And of course, above all, he was an internationalist. And it's him who's passed down to posterity that great anthem of internationalism. For all that and all that, it's coming yet for all that man to man the world o'er shall brothers be, for all that. Burns could see that more than 2 centuries ago. People, the great and the good of our time, still can't see it. And that's why Burns matters, and that's why nights like this matters. Thanks very much.